Well, welcome everyone to the May installment of the IPM Hour. Today's speaker is Ashley Larsen, who's an assistant professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara. She did her undergraduate work at UMich. I think I said that right, Ashley? I think that's pronounced UMich. And then did her graduate work at UC Santa Barbara. While I was researching Ashley's background, I was really intrigued by actually kind of an older paper from 2010, which was on coffee berry borer. We've done some work at the Center on coffee berry borer. And so this was work that I think she did while she was at University of Michigan, where she worked with John Vandermeer and Stacy Philpott on a project on ant predation of coffee berry borer in Mexico. It was interesting to me, this particular manuscript was interesting to me, not just because of the behavioral aspect and the control of coffee berry borer, which is important, but in the people who were involved. John, of course, is the author of the elementary mathematical ecology book that we all read as students. And I saw a talk a while back from one of the former students from Stacy Philpott's lab. That was Esteli Jimenez Soto, which was on the intersection between sociological and ecological aspects of coffee production. So I thought that was all kind of an interesting sort of confluence of events. Anyway, today Ashley is going to talk about pesticide use on organic farms in the Central Valley of California. Ashley.
Excellent. Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. Great. Thank you all for coming and for the invitation. I'm really excited to present this work. It's a pretty new project that, for the most part, kicked up during COVID, or at least came to completion during COVID, and like many other things that came about during COVID, hasn't been properly socialized. So I'm really excited to hear your feedback and get a chance to present some of this work. As Matt said, my background, I have an undergrad in ecology from Michigan, where I actually did do a lot of field work, thinking a lot about tritrophic interactions and how those related to agricultural pests and natural enemies. As I progressed into graduate school, I became really interested in the economic aspects associated with pest control. So I pursued a master's in economics and then a PhD in ecology, and you'll see that flavor in my work, where I bring together theories and concepts and tools and collaborators from both ecology and economics to think about questions in sustainable agriculture. So I'm going to start out just giving a quick motivation and introduction to my research program a little more broadly, just to seed potential areas of overlap. And then I'll dive in to talk about organic agriculture and pest control based in Kern County, which is the backdrop to this slide here. And I'll wrap up with some ongoing work trying to decipher the impact of organics in the agricultural landscape, more from a landscape ecology perspective. I'm in a department with a lot of economists and social scientists, so I'm pretty used to people interrupting to ask clarifying questions. I won't be able to monitor the chat very well while talking, but feel free to interrupt if that's customary here, or I'm happy to take questions at the end. Okay, let's get started. Identifying and characterizing pesticide use on 9,000 fields of organic agriculture. Maybe. Okay, so as many of you are aware, agriculture covers about 40% of ice-free land, and as such, it has an enormous impact on both human and natural communities worldwide. Past 40 years or so, the development of high-yielding crop varieties in combination with widespread use of irrigation, fertilizer, and land use change has enabled an enormous increase in agricultural production, which is credited with reducing poverty and improving nutrition for millions worldwide. However, there's a downside to these technologies as well, and that's that there are numerous environmental and human health consequences associated with these intensive production practices and land use changes that have been and continue to strain both agriculture and natural systems. At the same time, demand for agricultural production is increasing, due to a larger and particularly a wealthier population that demands and wastes more calories. And that's the grand challenge that motivates my work, and I imagine many of your work, is how do we meet the food and dietary needs of this growing population with the least impact on natural systems? More specifically, I'm focused on understanding how to increase production on the current agricultural footprint, right, while reducing the environmental and ecological harm associated with production practices. Broadly speaking, my work can fall into three interrelated pillars of inquiry: thinking about the local and landscape determinants of ecosystem services and disservices, the biodiversity impacts of agricultural intensification, and lastly, the ecological drivers and impacts of land use change. Today, I'm going to discuss work in this first pillar. I'm mostly going to focus on this paper listed at the end, talking about trying to identify and understand pest control behavior on organic fields in Kern County, and hopefully some ongoing work, if there's time, trying to parse apart the landscape effects. Before doing so, I'm just going to give you a quick taste of some of my other work to illustrate potential areas of overlap. The majority of work in this arena has focused on how local and landscape complexity affect the amount and stability of insecticide use. And so this is a recent paper. I have the slides, or some of the result slides. I won't go through them right now, but where we tried to understand how local characteristics such as field size and landscape characteristics such as the amount of cropland nearby and the diversity of that cropland affected the amount, the variability, and sort of the unexpectedly high or positive semivariance of insecticide use. And in line with what we might expect from agroecological theory, right, we found more simplified landscapes, which you can either think about as more cropland in the surrounding or larger fields, consistently led to increases in the level variability in these unexpectedly high deviations in insecticide use, while crop diversity had the opposite effect. And as an aside for this audience, often this work and other papers of mine use insecticides trying to remove farmer and crop and year and region characteristics and use insecticide basically after I remove all that stuff as a proxy for pests. And that's because I lack long-term pest data that covers a reasonable spatial scale. So if you have pest data and are interested in collaborating, you just let me know. Anyway, moving on. The second pillar focuses on the consequences of agricultural intensification for biodiversity and ecological systems. And so here I think about things like how the intensification of agriculture, either through larger farms or through the uptake of technology, through simplified landscapes, et cetera, impact biodiversity and environmental quality. So for example, I've investigated how the spatial temporal variation in pesticide use might affect natural communities. And so one study here is we're basically trying to understand when and where high levels of pesticide use occur and how we might expect monocultures compared to diverse agriculture to impact natural systems over space and time. So this is one illustrative time series of pesticide use just for 2 crops, right? Where it's evident, and this will be no surprise, I'm sure, to this audience, that there are fairly consistent peaks and troughs in pesticide use, and the peaks that are offset by crop, right? So we have almond in gray and carrots in dash black, and we're looking at monthly pesticide use from 2005 to 2017, right? And you can see there are distinct peaks, and you can probably tell that they're roughly equally separated. So there's a lot of annual sort of calendar sprays, right? But the interesting aspect here is that they're offset by crops, right? And so we might imagine that different environmental impacts throughout the year are going to depend on surrounding crop composition. In fact, this was just a study that looked at birds, right? But we do see that there's overlap of high biodiversity areas with high pesticide use areas that shift, right, as the year progresses. And so here we're looking at the spatial distribution of high pesticide use areas, in particular the top 10th percentile of pesticides by sort of the monthly sum and when that's distributed across the year for pesticides that are particularly toxic to birds, as well as the 10th percentile of bird species richness. Right? And so we see the hotspots of pesticide use, which are in red, shift in sort of density and spatial distribution, etc., throughout the year as we move from January to May to September. And that results in the location and hotspots moving as well, right? And so the hotspots are just illustrated in dark blue. Birds, that's based on species range and habitat suitability. So that isn't moving in this analysis, right? What's really moving is pesticide use throughout the year. And that's what drives this relationship. So this is implications for thinking about how hazards from pesticide use manifest throughout the year, right? And when they may overlap with sensitive life history periods, migrating species, et cetera, and when there's very little overlap. Okay, and the last pillar thinks about the ecological drivers and impacts of land use change. And again, this is probably not news to this audience, right? But as we think about meeting new groundwater sustainability requirements, it's going to entail presumably a good amount of land use change, right? And so thinking through how the location of long-term fallowing or retirement is likely to progress and whether it can be strategically allocated to provide both water savings and that habitat for biodiversity. In this paper, we basically showed that meeting water savings targets was relatively inexpensive in terms of land set aside and foregone crop revenue. And you got a lot of biodiversity benefits just out of meeting water savings targets. But if you actually wanted to meet biodiversity targets completely, the cost grew dramatically as the location of low value cropland was both insufficient in amount and in suitable habitat areas. Okay, so that's hopefully seeded some ideas, and I'd be very happy to follow up with anyone on topics of interest. But today I'm going to dive into work in this first theme. In particular, I'm going to focus on organic agriculture and pest control behavior in organic fields. First, just a little background on organic agriculture. So organic cropland covers about 1.5% of global croplands, but it's been increasing dramatically, right? In the past 20 or so years, the area under organic management has grown from 15 million hectares in 2000 to 73 million hectares today, which is just about quintupling, right? The industry is worth over $100 billion a year, with a large minority of that market originating in the US. The growth of organic production is fueled both by consumer demand for organic foods, right, and policies promoting organic production. So for example, the EU's Farm to Fork program has the ambitious goal of increasing organic production to 25% by 2030, which is a remarkable goal. And I think it's particularly remarkable given what we don't know about the environmental impacts of organic production relative to conventional production. How should we be thinking about this? This wire is really going to get me. Anyway, there are many dimensions, right? There are a lot of different dimensions to thinking about the relative benefits for organic production, which we can group, or which have been grouped by Seifert and Ramakutty, into production, environmental, producer, and consumer aspects. So these are things like yields, pesticide use, pesticide exposure, prices, profitability, soil organic carbon, among many others. And for some of these variables, we have a decent amount of data and understanding. This figure is from this review paper, right? Looking at how organic agriculture stacks up to conventional agriculture across these different dimensions. The red circle you see in the background, that's the conventional baseline, so to speak. The length of the flower petals represents the magnitude of the difference, whereas the colors represent the different production, environmental, producer, and consumer groups, and the shading represents the level of confidence. So there's fairly strong support indicating that organic has greater profitability, right? Lower energy use, lower pesticide residues on food. But what you also might note is the large number of gray petals. And those gray petals indicate variables that cannot be quantified due to a lack of data, right? And you can see there's quite a bit of gray. And so this question arises of why this knowledge gap persists, right? Organics have been around for quite a long time, right? What's driving this? I think part of the challenge is that scientists generally don't know where organic fields are, right? We generally only have data from a group of willing farmers, right, or experimental fields, neither of which might be representative of producers sort of in the wild, so to speak. And even if we could identify where organic fields are, in the absence of other data on crops or farm structure or landscape characteristics, agronomic characteristics, pesticides, etc., it's difficult to make unbiased comparisons, since we can likely assume the location of organic fields is probably not random, right? We might imagine organic producers grow different crops, right? They might be located in different areas. They might just be different farmers in terms of risk preferences or environmental preferences, etc. And as such, it's been really difficult to understand the environmental and other aspects of organic relative to conventional production, which I think is even more notable given the policy push to increase organic production in the near future. Okay, so today I'm going to try to shed some light on organic production in California, particularly in Kern County. And the first question I'm going to try to address, and the primary question I should say, is how does organic and conventional fields differ with respect to their pest control behavior? The second is going to be some ongoing work, which I'm really excited about, trying to understand how organic production influences surrounding growers. I'll spend the majority of time on this first series of questions, trying to get a sense of where organic fields are, first of all, and then how they consider pest control decisions relative to conventional farms. So we're going to try to break that decision of how much pesticides to use into a two-part problem, right? One, does the farmer spray or not? And two, if spraying, how much do they use? We'll tease that apart by different pesticide types like insecticides and herbicides, right, as well as pesticides that are of potential hazard to mammals, birds, etc. Then we'll look at crop-specific differences for commonly grown conventional and organic crops in the region. And lastly, we'll try to adjust for a yield gap using measures from the literature to see whether that impacts our results. Hopefully there's time at the end to get to some of the second question, but we'll see. Okay, to back up just a little bit before we sort of hop into the analysis, right? Why of all dimensions, right, are we talking about pesticides? There are a couple of reasons, right? First, pesticides and the associated health, farm worker, and environmental concerns are a primary motivator of consumer preferences for organic production. So this is a topic of great interest to consumers as they make their decisions of whether or not to purchase organic production. Second, farmers apply a substantial amount of pesticides, right? Global expenditures on pesticides are about $56 billion a year, which equates to the use of about 2.7 billion kilograms of active ingredients. While pesticides enable the production of a larger quantity of crops, thus available at lower prices, right, there's also substantial evidence of negative effects of pesticide exposure and numerous ecological taxa, as well as human health. And of course, behind the scenes, right, motivating pesticide use is the risk of pest damage. So pests destroy about 1/3 of potential crops, and thus reducing loss to crop pests is an important means to increase production on the current agricultural footprint. And yet quantifying the difference in pest control behavior is a huge challenge, right? Organics are commonly perceived to be chemical free, right? But organic as a regulatory definition, at least in the US, restricts the types of chemicals used rather than the amount, right? The regulation doesn't itself require chemical-free farming, and organic acceptable ingredients are not always low toxicity to different environmental endpoints, right? But we don't know what organic farmers or what treatments are occurring on organic fields, right? Because pesticide data are often aggregated both spatially and temporally and just sort of get mixed in. So we don't know either where they are or what they're using. Okay, so for the research I'm going to talk about for the rest of today, we're going to try to dive in and overcome some of these challenges in a specific place, and that's Kern County. Kern, as many of you are aware, grows a large variety of high-value, high pesticide use crops like almonds, grapes, carrots, etc. This top figure is illustrating the distribution of the major crops in the area, right? As well as in the bottom figures, field size, so how big the individual fields are, soil quality, which is the California Revised Story Index, and pesticide use. And these field level pesticide, this field level pesticide use data is mandated by state regulation, as many of you are probably aware. What makes Kern fairly unique is that they provide field polygons going back quite some time that enables the spatial analyses I'll discuss. So we're going to use these data to both help identify organic fields and evaluate pesticide use behavior. Okay, so how do we even find these organic fields? We started out, and this was a huge endeavor, so I'll keep it short, but to give you a sense, we started out doing a public records request for the location of organic cropland from the state organics program, which requires that certified organic producers with an expected gross sale over $5,000 are registered. So these field locations are provided either as assessor's parcels number or as public land survey sections with less than systematic formatting, we'll say. So after substantial data cleaning, we linked these with the Kern fields, right? The problem there is that multiple fields can be included in a parcel. Certainly multiple fields are included in a public land survey section, which is about a square mile. And so we further restricted the fields that we consider organic to be those that are in these registered parcels or registered public land survey sections that only used organic approved chemicals. To classify those chemicals as organic or not, fortunately, my two co-authors here, Sophie McComb and Claire Powers, were willing to dig through the pesticide label information, product registration information, and hand classify the most commonly used chemicals as either organic or not in an iterative process until we were confident that we had isolated all the organic fields. I'm happy to talk about any of that later on. Okay, so then using the organic fields we just identified, we then extract information on soil quality, again, based on the California Revised Story Index, and then use details from Kern County, from those field polygons, to extract information like crop type, farm size, field size, etc. Okay, so just some summary statistics. Year to year, about 7 to 11% of Kern County registered cropland is organic in terms of the fields that the county has permitted. It goes from about 936 in 2013 to a max of 1,544 in 2017. So it's growing over time with some ups and downs. Intriguingly, to us, the top actively cultivated crops had almost no overlap with the conventional top crops, right? Organic producers were primarily growing carrots, potato, lettuce, and tomatoes, right? Whereas the top conventional crops were perennials, so almonds, pistachios, grapes, and alfalfa. Even more interesting, at least to us, we found the majority of organic fields belong to farms that also had conventional fields, right? There are very, very few organic-only farms in our data. Here are a few more summary stats. So here we're looking at all fields as well as several individual crops. These are the crops that are fairly widely grown in conventional methods and also have at least 100 organic fields in our study period, which is 2013 to 2019. We first see that, so all fields, carrots, grapes, etc. And then the next column breaks it down, conventional and organic, right? The total number of observations for each of those. And then mean field size, mean soil quality, where 1 is better, and mean levels of active kilograms per hectare of active ingredients of pesticides. So if we just focus on all fields, right, we see field size for organic fields is generally smaller than for conventional fields. It's generally on better soil, which holds for all crops, and it generally uses less average pesticide use. Not shown here, but organic fields are also part of much larger farms than their purely conventional counterparts. Okay, so where did we take it from here? Basically, we tried to understand what's determining, right? There's particularly since organic producers grow very different crops and potentially in different regions, right? On different farms, there's potential that these relationships we see in the summary stats are not, are confounded by other variables, right? So we proceeded through from fairly simple analyses through to panel data models and eventually decided to think about this as a two-part problem, right? Or all farmers can make the decision to spray or not, and then they can make the decision of how much to spray. And we felt that that decision going from 0 to 1 or 0 to positive was different than going from, let's say, 1 to 2, right? That there was some discrete change in the behavior of an individual if they decide to spray at all, compared to the decision of how much to spray. And so we're going to model these two decisions using what's known as a double hurdle model, where the first hurdle is that binary decision, and the second is the decision of how much. I won't linger on the math, but just briefly for the curious, right, that first decision is this binary decision. We estimate it with a random effects Provent model with a farm by crop family, so the crop taxonomic family interaction, random intercepts. The second is a linear model with the same setup, the farm by crop family random effect, where we're assuming that the response, so how much pesticide use is used on fields that do spray, follows a log normal distribution. In both hurdles, we're going to include covariates for soil quality, field, and farm size, since they seem to be correlated with whether or not a field is organic, right, and may determine pesticide use. Happy to chat further in the Q&A. Okay, so recognizing that different crop types might have different relationships between organic status and pesticides, we repeat those log normal hurdle models for each of a few crops, these crops that were fairly widely grown and had at least 100 organic fields, which were carrots, grapes, oranges, potatoes, and onions. And this allowed for different slope and intercept by crop type. We're then going to assess the potential for a yield gap on our results, right? And it's commonly observed that there's a reduction in yields on organic production. How might that affect our results? So we modify our per hectare pesticide use rates following Panicio et al. As a robustness check. We group commodities following the groupings that she uses and we give them the yield gap estimates for that group. And crops that didn't fall into those groups got the all crop average. And lastly, right, this is pretty important for sure, is we use broad metrics of toxicity based on the pesticide label. So for example, we note a chemical as harmful to birds if it's above the toxicity threshold required for it to be, for a mention of birds to be in the hazard statement on the label, right? And there's, the label is governed by a whole bunch of standard toxicity tests, right? And if it exceeds that threshold for birds, it gets labeled as potentially harmful for birds. Ideally, we'd have more detailed toxicity information, but the data needed to calculate many of the aggregate indices like the pesticide load, the environmental impact quotient, et cetera, aren't available for all of the chemicals in our study, right? And I'll talk about this more later on. So we attempted to calculate pesticide toxicity index for fish, which is a well-studied endpoint. However, only about 70% of the chemicals used in our study had published toxicity, and pesticide products used in our organic fields were much less likely to have that toxicity information. And again, we get toxicity at the chemical, and there can be multiple chemicals in a pesticide product. So as we tried to create this weighted index, it becomes problematic when there's missing information. Still, I'll briefly discuss what I'd consider a highly preliminary investigation because of this non-random toxicity data. I see there's a chat. Let's see if I can even pull it up. Okay. Okay.
You want me to read that one out loud for everyone, or do you want to do that?
I can read it out loud. So Clayton Myers asked, what was the reason for using kilograms applied as the pesticide measure instead of acres treated? Since different active ingredients have different toxicity and efficacy profile, a kilogram approach lumps a lot of different things together, whereas treated acres normalizes the use of pesticides regardless of the application rate per acre. I noted for some crops, the kilograms applied was actually higher for organics and conventional, for example. Great point. That is true. For some crops, it was. The reason we used basically the amount of pesticides used is in part the challenge of deciding when a spray is different, right? So sometimes people try to say how many times was a field treated as a measure of pest pressure, let's say, instead of the amount. But right, often there are tank mixes, often it goes for more than one day, et cetera. And when to break down the, when to sort of put the bounds on a treatment event was something that we decided was messier than kilograms of active ingredients. But great question, and I'm happy to address them as they come in. Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm just going to introduce you to these tables. Not the most beautiful of figures, I apologize. So the first hurdle, right, is this decision of whether to spray or not, right? So this binary choice, yes, no. Here we're looking at the probability of pesticide use, right, where the y-axis indicates the average marginal effect from that binary model. And on the x-axis are the different types or endpoints for pesticide use, right? And we limited this to endpoints where there was a sufficient number of comparisons. I can't remember the exact cutoff, but we have it in the paper, and we have the average for organic and conventional in the SI. So we have all pesticide active ingredients, all pesticide products, products are active ingredients plus adjuvants. And then we have pesticides that act as insecticides, and then pesticides with drift, fish, or bees in the hazard statement on the pesticide label, as well as pesticides that were higher EPA signal word 1 and 2, right, or lower EPA signal word 3, 4 missing for acute toxicity to people. And so for all active ingredients, right, way over on the left, we find that being organic relative to conventional leads to an average of a 31 percentage point decrease in the probability of pesticide use, right? We see some variation by endpoint, so it's about 18 to 31 percentage points for these other endpoints, right? But holding all else constant, we see this fairly large decrease in the probability of treatment at all. So organic fields are more likely to be pesticide-free by a good margin. For the second hurdle, we evaluated what drives the amount of pesticide use on fields that decided to spray. And again, the different endpoints or different sort of metrics are on the x-axis. And the y-axis now represents the percent change in pesticide use for fields that do use pesticides. And so we see, with the exception of lower acute human toxicity products way over on the right, we generally see a negative coefficient, right? So a slightly negative effect of being organic, but the coefficient is only significant for high acute toxicity products, so EPA signal word 1 and 2. Here, for those higher toxicity products, we see organics leads to a significant 27% decline in the amount of use per hectare, and a significant 28% increase in lower toxicity products, so more or less a substitution. Okay, since crops vary in the amount of pesticides and conceivably in pest management between organic and conventional production, we reran these double hurdle models for each of 5 crops. Again, these were crops that were fairly widely grown and had at least 100 organic fields. The top figure, we're looking at that first hurdle, right? The decision to use any pesticides, right? And we see pretty much across crops that the probability of using any pesticides is reduced by 20 or so percentage points, right? Obviously variable. Anyway, the bottom figure, right? We see pretty substantial crop-specific effects for fields that do spray, right? We see very large decreases in pesticide use for some crops and very large increases for others. Okay, and when we adjust for potential yield gaps, our first hurdle doesn't change, right? It's a binary response. The second hurdle is shifted up, right? It remains fairly similar, right? Most coefficients are near or slightly above 0 now, and the only statistically significant difference is for low acute toxicity products. It's worth noting again that our measure of toxicity was far from perfect, right? I certainly wouldn't hang my hat saying that organics use the same toxicity products as conventional fields, right? What we're really interested in is how that difference in average pesticide use behavior that we saw in the summary stats manifested in these 2 different decisions. When we did try to weight pesticide toxicity by toxicity to fish, right, which I mentioned was incomplete. We only had about 70% of our chemicals match, and only about 35% of our organic fields had at least 70% of their chemicals match. We see hints that organics use less toxicity weighted chemicals, at least for fish, right? We could clearly use better data here to say more about the toxicity differences between organic and conventional fields. Okay, what about other drivers of pesticide use? So generally speaking, we saw soil quality, and this was again the California Revised Story Index, reduce the probability of pesticide use. So that first hurdle, possibly suggesting some type of compensatory effect where crops on better soil maybe have less need for treatment at all. Once treated, this effect was non-significant in determining the amount used. Farm and field size were pretty interesting to me. So we see both leading to an increase in the probability of using any pesticide use, right? However, given a field was treated, we actually see farm size leads to a decrease in the amount used. And this is interesting because there's both ecological and economic reasons, right? Why we might think that field size, for one, leads to an increase in pesticide use, right? Ecologically, we might think there's a larger edge to area or a smaller edge to area ratio, right? Natural enemies might provide less biocontrol in larger fields. Economically, we think that farmers have more control of their field because it's larger, right? They realize more of the benefits of spraying, less proportionally might drift. Their neighbors have less influence on the pest population in their field, et cetera, et cetera. But that doesn't really explain why we would see an effect in the first hurdle and not in the second hurdle. So still thinking there and very open to thoughts. Last thing here, organic versus conventional. Unsurprisingly, I'd say, based on what we saw in the summary stats, right? Organic is not a random draw of fields. They were generally produced on better soil on average, and this held even after we tried to remove heterogeneity by crop type, right? They were also generally larger farms and smaller fields. Okay, so just to recap the main innovations of this project, right? It was first to identify these organic fields, right? This was a huge lift in just knowing where they were and trying to understand what type of crops are more commonly organic. What are these other characteristics? How are they distributed in space? What we found from that is that organics are generally smaller in size, right? Part of much larger farms and on better soil. Organic agriculture on average uses less pesticides than conventional production, and this manifests in a lower probability of using any products, right? But a similar use on fields that do spray. But it's important that there's substantial crop-specific heterogeneity there, where in some cases the reverse relationships were observed. There are a few additional points I think that are worth pondering and some caveats to our work, right? First, organic farms are really large, right? They're 3.5 or 4 times larger than purely conventional fields. And we're generally a combination. So over 90% of organic fields, I think it was more like 97% to be honest, but over 90% of organic fields were part of farms that also had conventional fields. This was surprising to us. I'd say our thoughts on this is that perhaps it reflects a risk hedging strategy. If organic and conventional fields are exposed to different shocks, whether price shocks or different pest shocks, I guess if they're growing different crops, right, a portfolio might smooth some of that risk. There's also potential that there are economy of scale benefits to organic production, perhaps. And I'm again happy to hear your thoughts on that. Organics were generally on better soil, right, as measured by the California Revised Story Index, both on average and when comparing sort of carrots to carrots. And this suggests that if there are, if you went out and measured yields on 2 carrot farms, right, it would probably be an underestimate, right, because organics tend to be on better soils. Third, we see a little difference in the amount of pesticides used, right, and the amount of pesticides used that are hazardous, but at these coarse toxicity metrics. And I think having better toxicity information would really help us elucidate how the toxicity aspects spread between organic and conventional fields. Lastly, of course, pesticide use is just one of many of these important variables that are needed to understand how the environmental impacts of organic production. Okay, really quickly, I just want to share a couple slides and some ongoing work, which was actually the underlying motivation for really this whole thing. So here we're trying to understand basically how organic fields influence surrounding production. In Kern, as you're likely aware, right, it's a very high density agricultural landscape. So there's in this figure, all of these gray fields in all of these gray areas in figure A are all the permitted crop fields, right? And to the right, if you look at the sub figure E, right, it illustrates the number of fields very close by. So if we're looking at that focal field that has the bullseye, right, you can see within 500 meters, 1,500 meters, 2,500 meter buffers, right, there are tens of fields in the nearby surrounding. And so given the density of fields, we thought that pest and pesticide use might be influenced by management decisions on neighboring fields. In other words, perhaps organic fields might function as a refuge for natural enemies and provide spillover benefits for surrounding fields. Or perhaps they function as a weed source, right? And there's weed rains coming from organic fields that result in more herbicide use. And this builds on long-standing agroecological literature that emphasizes the value of local and landscape complexity and for reducing pests, as well as the importance of semi-natural habitat, right? And so here we're sort of shifting that conversation a little bit to say, does on-farm management, and in particular organic management, drive, in this case, pest control behavior, once again, because we lack pest data. So I won't get into the methodological details. I'm more than happy to. Basically, we calculate the amount of organic agriculture surrounding each field, right? We look at this 2,500 meter buffer as well as smaller annuli to see if closer fields have a larger impact. We're going to use some different approaches here and rely on some panel data models with farmer, region, year, and crop family specific characteristics, and then run the models individually for organic and conventional fields. Curiosity is killing the cat, though, and there are two chats. So let's just see. Okay, I'm not an economist, but I suspect your hypothesis about hedging and farm diversification is near the mark. For many producers, organic acreage provides added value at an operational level. There's less downside risk since organic produce can be sold as conventional if needed. That's a great point, but not the reverse. Interesting. That is okay. Yes, the 3-year. So the next question, I love this. The 3-year transition time, how does that come into play? That's a great question. We fought with this one a lot because our data is 2013 to 2019, and we could track fields back in time, but we don't know what's eventually going to become organic in the later years, right? We don't know what was organic in the earlier years. And so if we are going to sort of use that sort of like a moving average time window to say what is not yet certified but going to be, we'd end up losing a lot of our fields. So that is certainly something worth thinking about. If anything, it's going to reduce the difference, right? We're going to underestimate the difference between organic and conventional because some things we're calling conventional are actually going to be organic. And so we can sign the bias, right? Our estimated effects are an underestimate, at least for the last paper. But we decided not to do that because of just how much smaller our sample would be. But great questions. Okay, so great. So what happens here? If we just look at all fields, right? All fields together, how does having some organic cropland influence your decision and how much pesticide use to apply, right? We basically see no effects. So if we look at pesticides altogether, insecticides, so only chemicals targeting insects or insect growth regulators, etc., fungicides, herbicides, and then insect/fungicides, so products that have dual action, which are fairly common because of sulfur and things like that. If we look at all fields, just how does having surrounding organic ag influence pesticide use? We see no effect. But if we let there be different relationships between organic and conventional focal fields, So if I'm organic, how does having nearby organic affect my pesticide use behavior? If I'm conventional, how does having nearby organic affect my pesticide use behavior? We see this null relationship is actually masking positive effects for organics, so positive effects for conventional, where nearby organics leads to an increase in many types of pesticides, particularly this seems to come down, at least for the next relationship to insecticides, right? So if I'm conventional, having organic nearby leads to this small but significant increase. If I'm organic, it actually leads to a decrease, right? So if I'm organic and there's organic fields nearby, I actually reduce my pesticide use. This primarily comes out in either insecticide-only products or products that have dual action. Oops. Okay, and if we parse it across space, right, using a series of concentric annuli from the focal field out to the 2,500 meter boundary, we see the largest magnitude of effects, right, are for the closest annuli, and it drops off with distance. So these results can be interpreted as the elasticity, right? So the percent change in pesticide use for a given percent change in organic production nearby. The x-axis are those different annuli distances, so 0 to 500 meters, 500 to 1,000, etc., out from the focal field, right? And so we see for a conventional focal field, which is the black filled circles, a 10% increase in organic production in that first annuli, so pretty much adjacent to the focal field, leads to about a 1% increase in pesticide use. The same change for an organic focal field, so if I'm organic and there's another organic field very close by, leads to about a 1.5% decrease. And for both, the magnitude peters out for the most part as distance from the focal field increases, as we might expect. So these results are pretty hot off the press last week. They suggest, and I would love your thoughts on it, right, that having organic fields nearby may generate both pest control benefits and costs. So perhaps it's a bit of a refuge for both pests and natural enemies, right? However, conventional fields, either because they're using different chemicals or they have a lower treatment threshold, right, it might result in them realizing more of the costs of having an organic cropland nearby, whereas perhaps the concentration of organic fields leads to a net benefit, right? Either again, because there's different types of chemicals used or different on-farm management. Either way, as organics become increasingly prevalent on the landscape, right, we might think that clumping organic production could reduce pesticide use basically on both types of fields, right? The more concentrated it is, seemingly has a greater benefit for organic fields. The more concentrated it is, the less organic fields are sort of nearby in terms of the number of conventional fields being impacted. Okay, I'll stop there. Just to wrap up, organic agriculture is increasing dramatically, right, given consumer demand and policy initiatives. Despite popular perception, we don't have a holistic understanding of the environmental impacts of organic fields. Today, we discussed one element, right, how organic and conventional ag differs with respect to the decision to spray pesticides, and if spraying, how much to use. We found that organics spray less on average, and that's because they choose to spray it all less frequently. When they do spray, they use similar amounts, right? Perhaps that shouldn't be surprising, right? Pest damage is expensive. There's a reason to spray. Perhaps spraying at similar amounts makes the most sense. Further delineating the organic, how organics impact pest control decisions on surrounding farmers, hopefully add to our understanding of both the ecological role of organic agriculture on the landscape and provide a better understanding of sort of the net environmental impacts of this increasingly widespread production and management type. Great. With that, just thank my collaborators, funding, and students, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks. Should I stop sharing?
You can stop sharing if you like. So if anyone has any questions, you can either take your mic off mute, which you should have that option, or you can type your question in the chat. I'll have to admit, I have about a half dozen questions that that were generated from your talk, but I'll give other folks a chance first. So like I said, if you have any questions, you can either take your mic off mute or you can type your question in the chat. And if somebody doesn't ask a question quickly, I'm going to jump in and ask at least one of mine. Not seeing any takers. I'll ask my question then. So this probably won't come as any surprise to you. The efficacy of many of the organic products is probably limited compared, I suppose that would be the best way to say it, compared to some of the conventional materials. Um, and I would suspect that that efficacy would, be part of the decision when deciding to spray. So the reason I say that, we have these focus groups that we often run at the center, which are pest management strategic plans, and we just did one for lettuce for Arizona and California. And there was a pest control advisor who attended the meeting who covers primarily organic production. And one of the things that he mentioned was that they have to rely principally on mechanical control for weeds because their herbicide options are pretty limited, at least the number of efficacious materials. So I would think that would come into play in their decision to spray or not.
Definitely, great question. For herbicides in particular, that we absolutely see that. We see very little, and that's one of the reasons you didn't see it on any of those figures, is we actually see very, very little herbicide use on organic fields, to the point that there's not even enough to identify a statistically significant relationship as we break it down by crops, right? And in that other analysis, I wish I put the summary stats in for that, but we see basically there's no effect of having organic nearby on organic herbicide use, because there's almost no organic herbicide use. So that's definitely something we do see. I love the efficacy idea on the other chemicals, though. It's a great point, and it's one thing that in that second hurdle, it's just something that we don't have a perfect handle on, in a similar way as toxicity, right? I think the really interesting aspect is how different organics are in their decision to use pesticides at all. I personally didn't expect that decision to be so different. In the second hurdle, there's a lot of space for refining to try to account for these aspects. And that's efficacy. Toxicity I've been thinking about and kicking around and mulling. Efficacy, I have to think about how I would get a handle on that. We do know the products, and so if there was, I guess, using the recommended rates or the recommended sort of revisit frequencies or something, we might be able to get at that. But that's a great point, and honestly a gap in what we've done. And I would welcome your ideas if you have thoughts on how to dig in more.
I do, but we'll leave that for another day.
Okay, well, I'll follow up over email. Great.
All right. Any other questions? I'm not seeing anything in the chat at present.
Matt, I'll ask one.
Yeah.
Maybe it's more of a comment. It would be interesting to see this same sort of analysis from an area where you would think the organic and conventional farms were more similar, right? Like maybe Central Coast area, because in Kern County, there's just such great difference between the organic and the conventional crops and the farms, that you might have very different answers when you go to a different region. The other thing I'm thinking is, in carrot production in Kern County, the primary pesticide use is a pre-plant fumigation, which is enormous rates. And then after that, there's very little pesticide use. So it's, I don't know how much that plays into it, really driving that kilograms.
We do. So we broke it down for a couple of those crops by pesticide application type. We do see, for grapes, we actually see an increase in pesticide use on organic fields, right? We see the opposite for carrots, right? If you break it down by type, fungicides often are what is sort of differentiating that. And if you look at, just insecticides or something like that, it is a smaller difference anyway in these crop specific analyses than certainly than anything that could be fumigated, basically.
Great. All righty. I think that might be it for questions, Ashley. You got off pretty light today. I thought there was going to be more. I thought Clayton for sure was going to. Clayton is from USDA OPMP, which is the Office of Pesticide Management and Policy in Washington, D.C. And
I definitely have more, Matt. I'm going to reach out to Ashley about doing a seminar for OPMP. So
I figured. Ashley, we do have one more question in the chat. So it says, to increase efficacy, organic farmers may do more sprays. The decision of spray was based on, was the decision to spray based on a threshold for each pest or disease?
I would love that to have been the case. No, the reality is this is from the pesticide use data, right? So the decision, we basically looked at each field, right, and calculated how much pesticide use they used of these different types, right? We do have controls for farmer, right? So if some farmer has a preference of, actually having a scout in the field and some doesn't or something like that, then some of that heterogeneity would be removed, right? Where this would really come in, not to be effective, removing the farmer-specific characteristics would be if you only send a scout to your organic field or something like that because of the difference in value.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment, we haven't come up with a good way to tease that apart, right? If you use different thresholds, there's not and we're looking at organic fields within that farm. There's not a great way. We could do sort of like an organic, or a farmer by organic, but then it's only models only identified from different organic fields within that same farm. And if they use fairly similar behavior on all those organic fields, the remaining variations can be very low. And so we don't know why, when farmers spray, we try to remove this heterogeneity, particularly in the second analysis I showed. So like we tried to remove, difference out farmer level averages, crop level averages, public land survey township averages, if there was some sort of regional aspects to this, or sort of pests or weather or something that was a little more regional, as well as year specific effects. So after we remove all of that variation, we're then trying to say how nearby organics affects pesticide use, but we still don't we still can't tie pesticide use to pests directly, is the truth. We're saying sort of after you remove all that stuff, that the remaining variation is probably indicative of pests. But the truth is, that was what my pitch was earlier about, if any of you have pest data and want to chat, I'm all ears, because it's a major challenge.
So we have one more question for you. Did you expect the neighboring field effect?
I would say in some ways, yes, right? Like from agroecological theory, right? We'd think that lower intensity management might have pest control benefits, right? It might be harbor some natural enemies, et cetera. That's at least what we'd think from agroecology. Definitely didn't expect it to sort of parse apart based on the focal fields type. We expected to potentially see more herbicide use and less insecticide use, I think, were our a priori expectations. The split, I gave you my best explanation on why conventional might spray more and organic spray less for having an increase in organic production nearby, but that is all just trying to think through what the results could mean.
Yeah. All righty. I think that does it for us. We're at 1 o'clock. Thanks again, Ashley. That was terrific. Well, we do have one more question for you, Ashley. Do you feel like fielding it?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question, right? Talking to farmers would be hugely beneficial. And so in a related project that's looking at some agricultural land retirement during the drought, we're actually working with a social scientist who's going to go out and do stakeholder interviews about these types of on-farm management changes. So we're hoping to get some insight from that in terms of how farmers perceive changes in management nearby, including the change to organics.
Yeah, makes sense. All righty. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.